Now, with those remarks in the background, let's turn and think about the kinds of public tests which are available. And I'm going to be working from a list just to give you an idea of what the range is that were list was compiled by Robert Ennis, who is here today. And he divides his list into general critical thinking tests of the multiple choice variety. He has included here one essay test, and then what he calls aspect-specific critical thinking tests. And the total number of tests on this, and Bob has probably expanded this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 tests. So you can see that there are a range of tests that are in the ballpark. And I'm sure Bob wouldn't have put a test on here unless it had some credibility to it. So what are the names of some of these tests? Basic Skills for Critical Thinking is a test published by Greenhaven Press. The Cornell Critical Thinking Test Level X by Robert Ennis. The Cornell Critical Thinking Test Level Z by Robert Ennis. The New Jersey Test of Reasoning Skills developed by Virginia Shipman. Ross Test of Higher Cognitive Processes developed by John Ross and Catherine Ross. The Watson-Glaser Critical Thinking Appraisal. These are the multiple choice tests. And by the way, those of you who want a copy of this, will make that available for you. And then essay tests, the Ennis-Weir Critical Thinking Essay Test. So you can see, by the way, that Bob has generated a lot of these tests himself. Then aspect-specific critical thinking tests. Deduction, he gives us 3 tests that focus on deduction. The Cornell Class Reasoning Test, Form X, developed by Robert Ennis. The Cornell Conditional Reasoning Test, Form X, developed by Robert Ennis. And the Logical Reasoning Test by Alfred Hertzka and J.P. Guilford. And then finally, moving from deduction to observation, the test on appraising observations by Stephen Norris and Ruth King. Now, this is not an up-to-date list, but it'll just give you sort of a feeling for some of the tests that are out there. Let's look first at the categories. We have multiple choice, and then we have aspect-specific. So what does that mean? If you're looking at critical thinking tests, multiple choice means more, as Bob is listing it here, means there are, in some sense, the test is representing itself as dealing with critical thinking holistically, that is, the totality of it, and testing a variety of aspects of critical thinking. So that you could take different abilities, and the test is testing a range of such abilities. Now, there is no critical thinking test that exists that tests all critical thinking abilities. First of all, it's impossible to construct such a test because the list of such abilities is an open-ended list. You could never really end up with a complete set of all the critical thinking abilities. But you could develop a variety of tests that focus on important critical thinking abilities and sort of put them together in a package. Now, what happens in multiple choice tests then is they'll have a segment on this ability, a segment on this ability, a segment on that ability. Usually no more than 5 abilities will be assessed, or 5 aspects, if you will. And then they'll have a score on each of these, which will be added up and will be their total score. Presumably, this could have the diagnostic purpose. If you were concerned with these, you'd see where they scored higher and where they scored lower and perhaps follow up on it. But a question could be raised whether any test, which is called a critical thinking test, which separately assesses aspects, can actually be a legitimate, valid test of critical thinking where aspects are combined. In everyday life, and in most contexts where you do critical thinking, you don't use aspects separate from each other. You don't use abilities separate from each other. use a certain combination of abilities as you think through a problem. And so there's a difficulty with the critical thinking tests that call themselves global tests and are machine scorable, because their machine scorability more or less forces them to take the aspects or the abilities separately, but that means that there's a level of lack of realism in what is being tested. The analogy that I would use is something like this. What's the difference between evaluating the performance of a dancer while she or he is dancing Swan Lake and evaluating them by giving them separate ballet moves and asking them to do that separately in front of a set of evaluators? I take it that you might very well have somebody who looks very good at the ballet bar who is actually not the best at putting it together on the floor in actual performance. And this is a problem with multiple choice critical thinking tests as I view them. And I myself, over the last 4 years, worked with the Psychological Corporation on revising the Watson-Glaser critical thinking test, and I am not at all satisfied that that test, in fact, tests critical thinking in what I mean critical thinking to be, which is an orchestrated whole, not a movement from one aspect to another where somebody says, do this aspect, now do that aspect, now do the other aspect. Because when I do critical thinking in everyday life, there's nobody there to say, do this aspect, check this. So somebody could very well on a test do these things individually and therefore demonstrate that they're capable when somebody calls upon them to do it, but doesn't follow they'd actually do it in any other context when they weren't specifically called upon to do that particular thing. So you might be able to walk with good posture when we ask you to by putting books on your head, but then you might walk out of the room and not walk with good posture. So there's I think, a problem inherent in the multiple choice strategy for testing critical thinking overall. I think you can get valuable information from it, but there's a limitation. We should have no illusion that it's critical thinking as you might want to assess it in everyday life. Now, in the Ennis Weir critical thinking essay test, which is the one essay test that existed when this list was made, now we have an essay test which we've recently developed. But let me describe the Ennis Weir critical thinking essay test. It consists of giving students a letter to the editor. And in the letter to the editor, the person comes to a general conclusion and then lists all of the reasons in a sequence. My first reason is this, my second reason is this, my third reason is this, my fourth reason is this. And then the student goes through and reads it and, quote, evaluates the reasons. This is not machine scored. It has to be scored by persons who look at the reasons that the students give when they evaluate the reasons of the writer of the letter to the editor and compare them with an analysis which is provided them done by critical thinkers. So most of the reasoning presented by the reasoner is actually bad reasoning, and so it's an assessment of the student's ability to notice mistakes in thinking that are sort of classic mistakes in thinking. And so it is related to the area of critical thinking called informal logic and the recognition of fallacies in thinking, which is, of course, an important dimension of critical thinking. But let me tell you a little bit about my own experience in teaching fallacies. I used to teach critical thinking, mainly focusing on fallacies and their avoidance. And I had a list of 65 fallacies, which I divided into categories. And then I would go and present examples of the fallacies, explain why they were examples of the fallacies. Then I would test the students, giving them examples. They had to pick out the fallacy. Well, someone said to me once, how do you know what they would do if you gave them good reasoning? So I started throwing some good reasoning on these tests, And lo and behold, they found as many fallacies in the good reasoning as they found in the poor reasoning. What I mean is this. If there was any generalization, they called it hasty generalization. If there was any analogy, it was a faulty analogy. If there was any assumption, it was a questionable assumption. In other words, they were developing what my teaching assistants called fallacy frenzy. They would find fallacies anywhere they wanted to, and of course they wouldn't find them anywhere they wanted to. So if they were sympathetic, they didn't look for fallacies, but if it represented a point of view they didn't like, they found lots of fallacies. Well, this isn't critical thinking, so I was deceiving myself. I thought I was teaching them to think critically. Actually, I was teaching them to shoot from the hip and to nail the opposition. Or to put it another way, I was teaching them to be weak-sense critical thinkers, teaching them to be sophists, teaching them how to negate what they want to negate and probably defend what they want to defend to some extent, although that was not the major concern. So one of the concerns would be in assessing using this essay test is how much do we want to focus on fallacies, and then also if we're going to teach using this, how do we get around the tendency of students to simply use fallacies selectively or think about them not in a theoretically defensible way, that is where they say, okay, there are good analogies and weak analogies, valid generalizations and invalid generalizations, and be able to discriminate the two. This is a lot harder to teach than to give them a term, some examples, and then get them to sort of pick out cases using those examples. So I think the Ennisware essay test is a good test of its kind, very well done, and can be very useful, but then we have to think of how we're going to contextualize this. Bring it back to the classroom, use it in terms of the design of our instruction.